I remember the exact moment my life split into two versions of itself. The one where I was blissfully ignorant, and the one where every memory suddenly felt like a carefully staged lie. It was a quiet Tuesday evening, the kind where the sky outside our suburban home glowed in soft shades of amber and gray, and the scent of rain lingered in the air without ever fully falling. I was standing barefoot in the kitchen, the cool marble tiles pressing against my skin as I stirred a pot of tomato basil soup, the aroma rich and comforting, wrapping around me like the illusion of a perfect life I believed I had. My husband, Daniel, was supposed to be working late again. Another client emergency, another excuse delivered with that tired smile I had come to trust more than my own instincts. Our home was silent, except for the ticking clock above the fridge and the faint hum of the refrigerator, a silence that had once felt peaceful but had slowly turned into something hollow, something that echoed too loudly in my chest. I didn't know it yet, but that silence was about to shatter. It started with something small, almost laughably insignificant. A notification on Daniel's old iPad, the one he claimed he hadn't used in months. I had picked it up absent-mindedly while cleaning the living room, intending to move it into his office, but the screen lit up before I could set it down. A message preview appeared, just a few words, but enough to send a strange ripple through my body. "Daddy, are you coming tomorrow? I miss you." My fingers froze midair, my breath catching somewhere between confusion and a creeping, unnameable dread. Daddy. The word echoed in my mind like a distant thunderclap. We didn't have children. We had tried. Yes, months of hope followed by years of quiet heartbreak, of doctor visits and whispered conversations that always ended in tears. But we never had children. So why was someone calling my husband Daddy? I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Something innocent. Something harmless. Maybe it was a wrong number. Maybe it was a joke. Maybe. But even as I tried to rationalize it, a cold heaviness settled in my stomach, anchoring me to a truth I wasn't ready to face. My hands trembled slightly as I unlocked the iPad. The passcode still the same as always. Our anniversary date, a detail that suddenly felt cruelly ironic. The message thread opened, and with it, the ground beneath my feet disappeared. There were dozens of messages, stretching back months, no years. Photos, conversations, moments, a life, a whole other life. Pictures of Daniel holding a little girl with bright brown eyes and a gap-toothed smile. Videos of birthday cakes, candles flickering as a woman's voice, soft, warm, familiar in a way that made my skin crawl, sang in the background. Messages filled with affection, routine, intimacy. "I'll be there this weekend. Tell Lily I love her. I miss you both." Both. The words sliced through me. It wasn't just a child. It was a family. My husband had a family. I sank onto the couch without realizing it, the iPad slipping slightly in my grip as my vision blurred. My heart pounded so violently it felt like it might crack my ribs open, each beat louder than the last, drowning out every other sound. The room around me, the carefully chosen furniture, the framed photos of vacations and anniversaries, the life we had built together, suddenly felt like a set piece, something artificial and fragile, ready to collapse at the slightest touch. I kept scrolling, unable to stop, as if forcing myself to absorb every detail would somehow make it less real. Her name was Clara. That much became clear quickly. Clara, with her soft blonde hair and gentle smile, who looked at Daniel in photos with a kind of love I had once believed was reserved for me. Clara, who sent messages like, "Drive safe, we'll be waiting," and "Lily asked about you all day." Clara, who had no idea she wasn't the only one. Or maybe she did. The thought hit me like ice water. What if she knew? What if I was the other woman in my own marriage? A bitter, hollow laugh escaped my lips, though it sounded more like a broken gasp. My chest tightened, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. Memories flooded back. Every late night, every canceled plan, every distracted glance, every moment I had brushed off because I trusted him, because I loved him, because I believed in us. I thought about the nights I had sat alone at the dinner table, staring at the empty chair across from me, convincing myself that his absence was temporary, that his work was important, that our sacrifices would pay off. I thought about the quiet apologies he would offer when he came home late, the way he would kiss my forehead and promise to make it up to me. Lies. All of it. Carefully constructed lies. I don't know how long I sat there, lost in that storm of realization, but eventually something shifted inside me. The shock didn't disappear, but it hardened, crystallizing into something sharper, something colder. Anger. Not the loud, explosive kind, but a slow-burning fury that spread through my veins like poison, steady and deliberate. If Daniel thought he could live 2 lives without consequences, he had underestimated me. He had underestimated the woman who had stood by him through everything, who had given him years of her life, who had trusted him with her heart. I wiped my tears with the back of my hand, my movements suddenly calm, almost mechanical. My mind began to race, not with questions anymore, but with possibilities. I wasn't going to confront him. Not yet. No, that would be too easy. Too quick. He deserved to feel what I was feeling, to watch his perfect little world unravel piece by piece, just like mine had. But first, I needed to know everything. Every detail. Every lie. Every secret. I spent the next hour going through the iPad, documenting everything. Taking photos, saving messages, memorizing dates and patterns. Daniel's second life wasn't random. It was organized, scheduled with precision. Weekends away that he claimed were business trips were spent with them. Late nights at the office were evenings tucked into another home, another bed, another version of himself. He wasn't just cheating. He was living a double life with terrifying ease. And the worst part? He was good at it. Too good. By the time I heard the front door open, I had already locked the iPad and placed it back exactly where I found it. I stood in the kitchen again, stirring the now lukewarm soup as if nothing had changed, as if my entire world hadn't just been torn apart. My reflection in the window caught my eye, my face pale, my expression unreadable. I looked like a stranger to myself. "Hey!" Daniel's voice called out, warm and familiar, sending a sharp jolt through me. "Smells amazing in here." I turned slowly, forcing a small smile onto my lips as he walked in, loosening his tie, looking exactly like the man I had loved for years, the man who had lied to me every single day. "Long day?" I asked, my voice steady despite the chaos inside me. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You have no idea." Oh, I had an idea now, a very clear one. And as I watched him move around the kitchen, completely unaware that his secret was no longer safe, a quiet, dangerous resolve settled deep within me. He thought he was in control. He thought he could balance 2 lives without either one collapsing. But he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Because I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to break. I was going to ruin him, slowly, carefully, and completely. And by the time I was done, there wouldn't be a single piece of his perfect double life left standing. The next morning, I woke up before dawn, long before the first hint of sunlight touched the curtains, long before Daniel's alarm had the chance to go off, long before the version of me he believed in could come back to life and pretend everything was normal again. For a few seconds, I lay completely still, staring at the ceiling as the faint hum of the world outside slowly began to rise, the distant sound of a passing car, the soft rustle of wind brushing against the trees, the quiet rhythm of a neighborhood just beginning to wake up. And then it hit me again, just as violently as it had the night before. The messages, the photos, the little girl calling him daddy. Clara, it wasn't a nightmare. It wasn't something my mind had exaggerated in the dark. It was real, and Daniel was lying right beside me, breathing steadily, as if his conscience hadn't been screaming all night the way mine had. I turned my head slightly, studied his face in the dim light, memorizing every detail, the faint crease between his brows, the way his lips parted slightly when he slept, the same face I had once looked at with love and now saw with something dangerously close to disgust. It was almost fascinating how quickly love could rot into something unrecognizable when the truth finally surfaced. I slipped out of bed quietly, careful not to wake him, and made my way downstairs, my bare feet moving soundlessly across the wooden floor. The house felt different now. It no longer felt like a home. It felt like a stage where I had unknowingly been playing the role of a devoted wife, while my husband starred in a completely different story somewhere else. The kitchen still smelled faintly of last night's soup, a detail so painfully ordinary that it almost made me laugh. How could something so normal exist alongside something so devastating? I didn't bother making breakfast. Instead, I poured myself a glass of cold water. The chill grounded me as I leaned against the counter and began to think, not like a wife, not like a victim, but like someone preparing for war. Because that's what this was now. Not a confrontation, not a heartbreak, a war. And wars weren't won with emotion. They were won with strategy. By the time Daniel came downstairs, dressed in his usual work attire, tie perfectly knotted, expression calm and practiced, I had already decided my first move. I greeted him with the same soft smile, the same gentle tone, the same version of myself he had always known. "Morning," I said, sliding a cup of coffee toward him. He smiled back, completely at ease. "Morning. You're up early." "Couldn't sleep," I replied casually, watching him carefully as he took a sip of his coffee. There was no hesitation, no guilt, no flicker of anything unusual in his behavior. If I hadn't seen the truth with my own eyes, I would have believed him completely. That realization stung more than anything else. "I might have to stay late again tonight," he added, glancing at his watch. "Big project deadline." Of course, another lie, delivered so effortlessly it almost sounded rehearsed. I nodded, as if it didn't bother me. "That's fine. Just don't overwork yourself." The irony of my words didn't go unnoticed by me, but Daniel didn't catch it. He leaned over, pressing a quick kiss to my temple before heading toward the door, grabbing his keys like it was just another normal day. "Love you," he said on his way out. I paused for just a fraction of a second before responding. "Love you, too." The door closed behind him with a soft click, and the moment it did, the mask dropped. My expression hardened, my grip tightening around the edge of the counter as a wave of anger surged through me. But I didn't let it consume me. Not anymore. I had something much more powerful than anger now. I had control. Within minutes, I was upstairs again, retrieving the iPad and unlocking it with steady hands. This time, I wasn't just reacting. I was studying, analyzing. Every message, every photo, every detail became a piece of a larger puzzle I was determined to solve. Patterns began to emerge quickly. Daniel visited them every weekend without fail. Fridays after work, he would drive out, always the same time, always the same vague excuse, and return late Sunday night. The location wasn't explicitly stated, but clues were everywhere. Photos tagged in subtle ways, landmarks in the background, snippets of conversation. It didn't take long for me to narrow it down to a small suburban area about an hour and a half away. Close enough to maintain, far enough to hide. Clever, too clever, but not clever enough. By mid-morning, I had packed a small bag, my movement precise and deliberate. I didn't leave a note. I didn't send a message. I simply got into my car and started driving. The sky was overcast, the kind that threatened rain, but never quite delivered, and the road stretched out in front of me like a path I couldn't turn back from. My heart pounded with every mile, a mixture of fear, anticipation, and something darker, something that felt dangerously close to excitement. Not because I enjoyed this, but because I knew that by the end of this day, everything would change. The neighborhood was exactly what I expected, and somehow worse. A quiet, picturesque street lined with neatly trimmed lawns, pastel-colored houses, and a kind of peaceful atmosphere that screamed normalcy. It made me sick. I parked a few houses away, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I scanned the area, my eyes searching for any sign of him. And then I saw it, Daniel's car, parked casually in front of a small cream-colored house with a white fence and a porch decorated with potted flowers. It looked like something out of a dream, or a lie. My chest tightened as I stepped out of the car. The cool air hit in my face as I walked slowly down the street, each step feeling heavier than the last. I wasn't ready, but I didn't have a choice. As I got closer, I could hear faint laughter coming from inside the house, a child's laughter, light, carefree, innocent. It cut through me like a blade. I moved closer, stopping just short of the front gate, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it could be heard from inside. And then I saw them, through the window. Daniel was sitting on the floor, A little girl perched on his shoulders, her laughter filling the room as he pretended to lose his balance. His face, God, his face, was lit up in a way I hadn't seen in years. Pure joy, unfiltered happiness. And standing nearby, watching them with a soft smile, was Clara. She looked exactly like her photos, maybe even more real in person, warm, gentle, completely unaware of the storm standing just outside her door. For a moment, I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. This wasn't just betrayal. This was a life he had built, a life he had chosen. Over me, over us. My vision blurred, but I forced myself to stay focused, to absorb every detail, to let the pain burn itself into something stronger. Because this moment, this exact moment, was where everything shifted. I wasn't just the wife who had been lied to anymore. I was the woman who had seen the truth with her own eyes. And now, I knew exactly what I was dealing with. I stepped back slowly, retreating before anyone could notice me, my mind already racing ahead, calculating, planning. Confronting them now would be a mistake. It would be emotional, messy, ineffective. No, if I was going to destroy this illusion, I needed to do it the right way. I got back into my car, my hands no longer shaking, my breathing steady as a chilling clarity settled over me. I knew their address now. I knew their routine. I knew their weakness. And most importantly, I knew that neither of them had any idea what was coming. As I drove away, the house growing smaller in my rearview mirror, a slow, calculated smile spread across my face for the first time since everything began. This wasn't the end of my world. It was the beginning of theirs falling apart. Because Daniel hadn't just lied to me, he had underestimated me. And Clara, she had unknowingly built her happiness on stolen ground. Now it was time for both of them to learn exactly what that would cost. By the time I got home that evening, the sky had finally given into the weight it had been carrying all day, and rain poured steadily against the windows, each drop tapping like a quiet countdown to something inevitable, something irreversible. And as I stepped inside, closing the door behind me with slow, deliberate care, I realized that the woman who had left this house just hours earlier no longer existed in the same way, because something inside me had shifted permanently, something that wasn't just pain or anger anymore, but a cold, precise awareness of exactly how fragile Daniel's carefully constructed world really was, and more importantly, exactly how easy it would be to break if I pulled the right threads in the right order. Because now I wasn't guessing anymore. I wasn't imagining. I wasn't doubting. I knew, and knowledge was power, and power in the right hands could become something devastating. I didn't turn on the lights immediately, instead letting the dim gray glow from outside fill the room as I stood there for a moment, listening to the rain, grounding myself, because what I was about to do required patience, control, and above all, discipline, and I couldn't afford to make a single emotional mistake. Not when everything depended on precision. Because this wasn't about screaming the truth in his face or walking away with dignity. This was about making sure that when Daniel's life fell apart, it didn't just crack, it shattered completely, leaving nothing behind for him to rebuild from. I moved to the house slowly, almost ritualistically, setting my bag down, changing into something comfortable, tying my hair back as if I were preparing for something methodical rather than emotional, and in a way I was. Because revenge, when done right, wasn't chaos. It was design, and as I sat down at the dining table with my laptop and the iPad beside me, I began to map everything out, every detail I'd gathered, every pattern I had noticed, every opportunity waiting to be exploited. Because Daniel had made one critical mistake in all of this. He had assumed that his lies were invisible, that his two lives existed in separate worlds that would never collide. But what he hadn't accounted for was me standing exactly at the intersection of both. Claire was the key. I realized that almost immediately, not because she was the enemy, but because she was the variable Daniel couldn't fully control, the one part of his double life that relied on trust just as much as I had. And trust, once broken, had a way of unraveling everything around it. And if I could make her question him, not with obvious accusations, not with dramatic reveals, but with subtle, undeniable inconsistencies, then the cracks would start forming on their own, naturally, inevitably, and Daniel wouldn't even realize it was happening until it was too late. I scrolled through her messages again, studying the way she spoke, the way she trusted him, the little details. She shared about her life, her routine, her emotions, and there was something almost painfully sincere about it, something that made this entire situation even more twisted. Because she wasn't some manipulative accomplice or a calculated homewrecker. She was real. She was invested. She believed in him just as deeply as I once had. And for a brief moment, something unfamiliar flickered inside me, something dangerously close to sympathy. But I crushed it immediately, because sympathy wouldn't help me now. And whether she knew about me or not, she was still part of the life he had chosen over ours, and that made her part of the problem, whether she realized it or not. The next step required subtlety and, more importantly, invisibility, because I couldn't just reach out to her as myself. That would end everything too quickly, and I needed time. I needed space to build this slowly, carefully, like a structure designed to collapse under its own weight. And so I did what any rational person in my position wouldn't think to do, because rationality had no place here anymore. I created a new identity. Something simple, believable, harmless. Someone who could exist on the edges of Clara's world without raising suspicion. And within an hour, I had built an entire persona from scratch, complete with social media profile, a believable backstory, and just enough detail to feel real without being traceable, because if Daniel could live two lives so effortlessly, then I could certainly manage. One more. It didn't take long to find Clara online. Her digital footprint was soft but present. Small glimpses into her life scattered across platforms. Pictures of Lily playing in the park. Quiet moments at home. The kind of content that felt intimate without trying too hard. And I studied all, absorbing not just what she posted but what she didn't. The gaps between updates. The patterns in her routine. The subtle ways her life revolved around Daniel's presence without ever fully revealing him. And once I understood her world well enough, I made my move. Something small, something almost meaningless on the surface. A simple follow request sent late in the evening when people are more likely to accept without thinking too much, because their guard is down, their attention divided, and sure enough, within minutes, she accepted. That was the first crack, barely visible but significant nonetheless, because now I had a direct line into her world, and more importantly, she had unknowingly invited me in. I didn't message her right away. That would have been too obvious. Too eager. Instead, I let a day pass, then another, occasionally interacted with her posts in subtle ways. A like here, a short comment there, nothing intrusive. Nothing that stood out, just enough to become familiar, without being memorable, because familiarity breeds trust, and trust was exactly what I needed to build before I could begin dismantling it. Meanwhile, Daniel continued his routine as if nothing had changed, as if he wasn't standing on the edge of a collapse he couldn't see. And watching him now was almost surreal, because I could see everything, the lies behind his words, the patterns in his behavior, the way he checked his phone when he thought I wasn't looking, the slight shifts in his tone when he mentioned work. And it was almost insulting how confident he still was, how secure he felt in a life that was already slipping through his fingers. And part of me wondered if he would notice the change in me at all, if he would sense that something was different, something colder, more distant. But if he did, he didn't show it because he was too busy maintaining his illusion to notice the reality unraveling right in front of him. The first real interaction with Clara came 3 days later, and it was as casual as I had planned it to be, a simple reply to one of her posts. A picture of Lily holding a drawing, proudly showing it to the camera, her smile bright and unguarded, and I commented something light, something friendly, something that opened the door just enough without forcing it. And when Claire replied, warm and appreciative, I knew I had crossed an invisible threshold, because now we weren't just strangers on the internet. We were connected, however slightly, and connections, no matter how small, could be manipulated if handled carefully. The conversation grew slowly from there, evolving over the next few days into something more natural, more comfortable, and I played my role perfectly, mirroring her tone, her energy, her openness, giving just enough of myself to seem genuine while keeping the parts that mattered hidden. And it wasn't long before she began to share more, little details about her life, her struggles, her happiness. And through it all, Daniel remained a constant presence in her words, always spoken about with affection, with trust, with certainty, and each time she mentioned him, it felt like a quiet challenge, like the universe testing how far I was willing to go with this. But I didn't hesitate, because I had already crossed the line the moment I decided not to confront him, the moment I chose to stay and fight instead of walk away. The real turning point came when I introduced the first seed of doubt, subtle, almost invisible, woven into an otherwise harmless conversation. Because the key wasn't to accuse or suggest anything directly. It was to make her question things on her own, to plant an idea so small that it didn't seem threatening at first, but grew over time into something she couldn't ignore. And so when she casually mentioned Daniel working late again, I responded with something simple, something that sounded more like an observation than a warning. Something like, "That must be tough. My ex used to say the same thing all the time." And I left it at that, not elaborating, not pushing, just letting the implication linger quietly between the lines. And for a moment, there was no response, just a pause, a silence that stretched just long enough to be noticeable. And when she finally replied, her tone had shifted ever so slightly, not enough to be obvious, but enough for me to recognize it. A hint of uncertainty, a subtle hesitation, the first crack forming exactly where I needed it to. I leaned back in my chair, stared at the screen as a slow, controlled satisfaction settled over me, because this was working not in a dramatic, explosive way, but in the quiet, insidious way that mattered more, because Daniel's world wasn't going to collapse overnight. It was going to erode, piece by piece, trust by trust, until there was nothing left holding it together. And by the time he realized what was happening, it would already be too late to stop it. Outside, the rain continued to fall, steady and relentless, washing over the world as if trying to cleanse it of something it couldn't quite reach. And as I sat there in the dim light, watching the first signs of doubt take root in the life Daniel had built without me, I realized something that both terrified and empowered me at the same time. I wasn't just reacting to his betrayal anymore. I was shaping what came next, controlling the narrative, deciding how this story would end. And for the first time since everything began, I didn't feel broken. I felt dangerous. And Daniel had no idea what he had unleashed. By the end of the second week, the shift was no longer subtle. It was structural, like a foundation beginning to crack beneath the weight of something it was never designed to carry. And I could feel in the way Daniel moved through our home, in the way his voice carried just a fraction too much tension, in the way his eyes lingered on his phone just a second longer than usual before locking it, as if he could sense something slipping beyond his control, but couldn't quite identify what. And that uncertainty, raw, unformed, and quietly growing, was exactly where I wanted him, because doubt, once planted, doesn't need force to grow. It feeds on silence, on absence, on the spaces between words. And I had become very, very good at creating those spaces. I didn't confront him, didn't accuse him, didn't even question him directly, because that would have given him something to fight against, something to defend. And I wasn't interested in a battle he could see coming. I was interested in the slow collapse of everything he thought was stable, everything he believed he controlled. And the first visible crack appeared on a Thursday evening when he came home earlier than expected, his ties slightly loosened, his expression strained in a way that didn't match his usual composed demeanor. And I noticed it immediately, not because it was obvious to anyone else, but because I had spent days studying every version of him, learning the difference between his real stress and his fabricated one. And this was real. "You're early," I said casually from the kitchen, where I was slicing vegetables with careful precision, the rhythmic motion of the knife grounding me as I watched him from the corner of my eye. And he hesitated for just a fraction of a second before responding, a pause so brief it would have been invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. But I was, and that pause told me everything. "Yeah, things wrapped up faster than expected," he said, placing his keys on, the counter a little too deliberately, his movements slightly off, slightly forced, and I nodded as if I believed him, offering a small smile that didn't quite reach my eyes, because I knew exactly why he was home early. Not because work had ended, but because something else had begun to unravel, something he couldn't ignore anymore. Clara had started asking questions. I had felt it in our conversations, the subtle shift from warmth to hesitation, the way her messages had become slightly less certain, slightly more probing, as if she were trying to piece together something that didn't quite make sense, and I had encouraged it, carefully, gently, never pushing too hard, just enough to keep her thinking, to keep her noticing the inconsistencies that Daniel could no longer hide as easily as he once did. "You seem tired," I added, setting the knife down and turning to face him fully, my gaze steady, searching, not accusing, but not entirely passive either. And for a moment he looked at me like he was trying to read something beneath the surface, like he was wondering if I knew, if I had somehow discovered the truth. But whatever suspicion flickered in his eyes disappeared just as quickly as it came, replaced by that familiar mask of reassurance. "Just a long week," he replied, forcing a small smile. But it didn't hold, not the way it used to, and I could see the strain in it, the effort it took to maintain even that much composure. And it was almost satisfying, not in a cruel way, but in a way that felt like justice beginning to take shape, like balance slowly being restored after something had been thrown violently out of alignment. The tension didn't explode that night. It lingered, quiet and heavy, filling the space between us as we moved through our routines like two actors performing a scene neither of us believed in anymore. And later, when he thought I was asleep, I felt him shift beside me, his movements restless, his breathing uneven, and I knew, without looking, that he was on his phone, probably texting Clara, probably trying to reassure her, to smooth over whatever doubts had begun to surface. But the problem with lies is that they require consistency, and Daniel was starting to lose control of his narrative, because now there were too many variables, too many moments he couldn't perfectly align, and Clara wasn't as passive as he had assumed she would be. The next day, the real shift happened, not in my house, but in hers, and I felt. At the moment Clara messaged me, her tone different this time, less casual, more searching, like someone standing at the edge of a realization they weren't ready to fully accept yet. "Can I ask you something?" she wrote, and I stared at the message for a moment, letting the weight of it settle before responding, because this was it, the moment where curiosity turns into suspicion, where doubt begins to demand answers. And I had to be careful, because pushing too hard now could backfire, could make her defensive, could cause her to retreat back into denial, and that wasn't what I wanted. I wanted her to walk into the truth on her own. Of course, I replied simply, keeping my tone open, neutral, safe, and there was a pause before her next message, a longer one this time, as if she were choosing her words carefully, trying to make sense of something she didn't fully understand. "Do you ever feel like someone isn't telling you everything?" she asked, and there it was, not an accusation, not a conclusion, but a question, raw and uncertain, and I could almost picture her sitting there, phone in hand, heart racing just a little faster, wondering if she was overthinking, wondering if she was being paranoid. And I knew exactly how that felt, because I had lived in that space for far too long before the truth forced its way into the light. I didn't answer immediately, instead letting a few minutes pass, giving her just enough time to sit with her own question, to feel the discomfort of it, because discomfort is what drives people to seek clarity. And when I finally responded, I chose my words with surgical precision. Sometimes I wrote, and usually when that feeling shows up, there's a reason for it. And I left it there, no elaboration, no dramatic suggestion, just a simple truth that could mean anything and everything at the same time, and once again there was silence. But this time it wasn't empty. It was full, heavy with realization, with the slow, creeping awareness that something wasn't right, that something didn't add up, and I could almost feel the moment it clicked for her, not completely, not all at once, but enough to change the way she saw him, enough to make her start looking closer, asking more, noticing the details she had once ignored. And Daniel was starting to feel it too, because that night, when he came home, there was no mask, no easy smile, no casual excuse waiting on his lips, just tension, thick and undeniable, clinging to him like a shadow he couldn't shake. And for the first time since I discovered everything, he was the one who looked uncertain, who looked like he didn't know what came next. And as I watched him from across the room, calm, composed, completely in control, I realized that the balance of power had shifted entirely, because he wasn't managing two lives anymore. He was losing both, and he didn't even realize how close he was to the edge. The breaking point came sooner than I expected, not with quiet realization, but with a confrontation, sharp, sudden, and impossible to undo, because later that night his phone rang, and the moment he saw the name on the screen, something in his expression changed completely, something raw and exposed, and he hesitated, just for a second before answering, his voice low, tense, and I didn't need to hear the other side of the conversation to know exactly who it was, because Clara had reached a point where doubt was no longer enough. She wanted answers, real ones, and Daniel didn't have them. Not the kind that could hold under pressure, not the kind that could survive the truth pressing in from all sides. And as I stood there, listening to fragments of his carefully constructed world beginning to collapse under the weight of its own lies, I felt something settle deep inside me. Something final, something inevitable, because this wasn't just the beginning of the end anymore. This was the moment everything started to fall apart, and neither of them were ready for what was coming next. But I was, because I had planned for this every step of it, and now there was only one thing left to do: finish it. The day I decided to end it all, the carefully constructed illusion of Daniel's double life, was bright and deceptively calm, as if the universe itself was holding its breath, knowing what was about to unfold. The sky is soft, almost cruel blue, the sunlight spilling across the streets, the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming flowers masking the tension that thrummed in the air like an electric current. And I drove to their house with my hands tight on the steering wheel, each mile a countdown to the collision of worlds, each thought in my head meticulously rehearsed, because there would be no room for hesitation, no margin for error, no second chances. I parked my car a few houses away, letting the engine tick down to silence as I observed the cream-colored house with the white fence and the carefully placed potted flowers, the house that had become a stage for Daniel's lies, the house where a child's laughter had once filled the rooms and now would be replaced by chaos, because I wasn't going there to speak softly or to reason. I was going there to unmask every deception, to tear apart the carefully built walls of trust and make Daniel face the consequences of a life lived in duplicity. I stepped onto the sidewalk, my boots silent on the damp pavement, and I could see Clara through the window, kneeling beside Lily, brushing the girl's hair back from her face, smiling softly at the innocence that she had built her world around, a world that existed at the expense of someone else's life, my life, and I felt a cold satisfaction settle deep in my chest. I took a deep breath and rang the doorbell. The chime sounded loud in the quiet suburban street, a single, piercing note that carried with it the weight of everything that had been hidden. Clara opened the door, and for a moment her smile faltered, not out of recognition of me, not yet, but out of instinct, a subtle tightening of her jaw, the shift in her stance that betrayed an inner caution, and that was all I needed. "Hello," I said lightly, stepping forward with confidence, letting my presence fill the doorway without a word more, and she looked at me, curious but unsuspecting, because she couldn't know who I really was yet, couldn't know that I was about to destroy the very foundation she had trusted. Daniel appeared behind her, the moment stretching, the sunlight catching the sharp angles of his face, and I could see the flicker of recognition, though he tried to mask it with a casual smile, the same one that had fooled so many for so long. "I can help you?" Clara asked hesitantly, her voice careful, unsure, and I smiled, warm and controlled, letting my calm mask the storm inside. "Actually, I think it's time for the truth," I said simply, stepping inside the house as if I belonged there, as if this confrontation had been inevitable, and the moment I crossed the threshold, Daniel froze, his mouth opening slightly, his hands gripping the counter behind him as if bracing himself, but nothing could prepare him for what was coming. I turned to Clara first, meeting her eyes, letting her absorb my presence, my calm, the quiet weight of someone who knows everything. "You need to know," I began, soft but deadly, "that everything Daniel has told you, every lie he's built his life on, none of it was complete. You weren't the only one. You weren't the beginning. You weren't the truth." And in that moment, clarity dawned in her eyes, confusion giving way to the first hints of horror, as if her entire world had been flipped upside down in a single sentence. What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling, and I let a moment stretch, letting the tension build, letting Daniel squirm under the weight of unspoken truths, letting Clara feel the first sting of betrayal as I revealed the fragment of the life he had hidden, the messages, the photos, the weekend spent away, the little girl he held, as if she were the only one who mattered, the careful orchestration of two worlds. And as I spoke, the room seemed to shrink, the air thickening with disbelief and anger, with fear and shock, with the quiet, inexorable unraveling of everything he had built. Daniel tried to interrupt, to defend, to explain, but I cut him off, calm, precise, unstoppable, because this wasn't about argument. It was about revelation, about making him face the destruction his choices had caused, about showing him and Clara that trust once broken cannot simply be mended. Clara's face paled as the reality sank in, tears welling in her eyes as the world she had trusted crumbled, as the man she had loved, the father of her child, was exposed for who he really was, and for a moment she couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't breathe, because the betrayal was too vast, too encompassing, too personal. I turned back to Daniel, whose confident facade had completely dissolved, whose eyes darted between us, who now understood, truly understood, that his life had been meticulously dismantled without a single dramatic gesture on my part, simply by the slow, careful application of truth and doubt. "This ends now," I said finally, letting the words hang in the air, weighted with finality. "You will no longer juggle lives, lie to everyone, or manipulate the people who trusted you. Today, you see the consequences of every choice." He tried again to speak, but the words stumbled, hollow, meaningless against the gravity of the moment. Clara, her voice trembling but gaining strength, finally whispered, I don't know what to believe anymore," and I nodded, silently acknowledging that pain, because it was a pain of truth, the awakening from a dream built on deception, and it was necessary. Over the next hours, the confrontation continued, tense and raw. Each question, each revelation landing like a strike, breaking him down, exposing not just the lies he told others, but the compromises, the betrayals, the selfishness he had hidden even from himself. Daniel's carefully constructed double life collapsed in real time, not with shouting, not with violence, but with the slow, methodical unmasking of every secret he had ever kept, and Clara, though hurt, began to see not just his deceit, but the deliberate orchestration that had allowed her to trust him blindly, the careful manipulation that had left her blindsided, and though the confrontation left scars, it also laid bare the possibility of understanding, of seeing the full weight of a person's choices and their consequences. By the time the sun set and the room darkened, I stood outside, watching the rain begin again, heavy drops washing over the street, over the house that had been the stage for so many lies, and I felt a strange calm, a mixture of sorrow and satisfaction, because I had done what I needed to do, not just for myself, not just for justice, but for clarity, for truth, for the undeniable acknowledgement that deception has a cost, and every person who believes they can manipulate lives without consequence is eventually forced to face the fallout. I walked back to my car, quiet now, the storm inside me replaced with steady certainty, because revenge had been completed, exposure had been made, and though hearts were broken, though lives had shifted irrevocably, the balance had been restored, not with violence, not with anger, but with the undeniable power truth wielded with precision. And as I drove away, leaving behind the house, the little girl, Clara, and Daniel, I realized that the most terrifying, most powerful revenge isn't in the drama, the shouting, the chaos. It's in watching carefully, calculating patiently, and delivering truth in a way that leaves nothing standing except the consequences. And those consequences, when fully understood, are more devastating than any scream, any fight, any plea could ever be. Daniel would never forget me. Clara would never trust blindly again. And I, finally, had reclaimed my life, my power, my clarity, leaving behind a world reshaped by the truth, unflinching, irreversible, unforgettable.